What is healthier, plant-based meat alternatives or meat itself? There is so much debate when we talk about these things. You would think nutrition is akin to politics, and for some people, it kind of is. But a review article published in the Canadian Journal of Cardiology pits the two head to head, takes a deep look at the cardiovascular outcomes of these two things. One of the lead researchers in this is Dr. Matthew Nagra. He is a close friend and a friend of the show, and I'm so glad that he's here to clear up the confusion with us today. Welcome back to the show, Dr. Nagra.
Thanks for bringing me back on. What is this, number 4 now, 5, something like that?
4 or 5.
Love it.
I'm
Yeah.
losing count, but what I know is that the people are always happy when you're here, and so I just try to give the exam roomies what they want. And right now, Dr. Nagar, they want you. So
Love it.
no pressure. This is a cool article, man, and I know that it's made the rounds big time. Men's Health, NBC, blogs all over the place. You were just blowing up with this, and I think the title of the article is quite clever. Animal versus plant-based meat, a hearty debate. So the headline is beautiful, but the data that's included in it is equally as enticing. So let's just go ahead and get the results straight away. Plant-based meat alternatives or meat itself, even if that plant-based meat alternative is super processed, lots of salt, lots of fat, is that still a healthier option than, say, just chicken or steak itself?
Yeah, actually, just on the title really quick, it's funny that you mentioned that because originally the title was very long and really highlighting in detail kind of what we were looking at. But the journal kept saying, no, we need it shorter, we need it shorter. And we ended up with something that, as you mentioned, ended up being pretty good. Obviously caught a lot of headlines.
Absolutely, absolutely.
But as far as what we found, or rather what we did, maybe start there, is we looked back at the research on plant-based meat alternatives over the past 5 decades. And, I was curious to see what there was because for the most part, people are familiar with the famous swap meat trial out of Stanford University that was done a few years ago using Beyond Meat products and organic grass-fed meat products and comparing the two. But there were actually a number of other trials that looked at different types of plant-based meats, including one back in 1990 that was done in the UK. And that was probably the most surprising thing to me to see that we actually had data going back quite a while. So what we ultimately found, and we can certainly dive deeper into this as we go along, but just an overview, when we look at studies evaluating the nutrient profiles of these plant-based meats and comparing them to meat, we found that pretty much across the board, looking at studies done in European markets, in North American markets, even one down in Brazil, that plant-based meat alternatives tended to contain less saturated fat, less cholesterol. Most of them have zero cholesterol unless it's one of those products where they also include some eggs or dairy. It might have a little bit of cholesterol then. They tended to have more fiber, a bit more carbohydrates, and then less calories and more of the heart-healthy polyunsaturated fats per serving. So those are generally very good things when it comes to cardiovascular health. We want more fiber, we want less saturated fat and cholesterol. And then where there were sort of mixed results was with the protein content and the salt content. Those were all over the map depending on which products you're looking at and what you're comparing them to. So I would say there just wasn't a ton of consistency there. And those are maybe things that we need to pay attention to when we're choosing products. Now, if we look at the actual studies where they put them to the test, so fed these plant-based meats to people, say one group of people, and then fed animal-based meats to another group, and seeing what happens, we saw that the plant-based meats lowered total cholesterol, lowered LDL cholesterol, which is a better risk factor for cardiovascular health, for heart disease risk, really had little to no effect on systolic or diastolic blood pressure, being the higher and lower number on a blood pressure reading, which was a little bit surprising since they generally used very high salt products. There was a reduction in a marker called ApoB, which is also related to cardiovascular health, actually a very good marker for cardiovascular risk. And a couple studies reported reductions in body weight and waist circumference as well. So potentially a little bit of a benefit in that they're perhaps a little more filling, maybe because of the fiber, leading people to eat less down the road.
All right, so let me back that up. You said even the ones that had higher sodium content, the plant-based meat alternatives there, they didn't necessarily raise a person's blood pressure the way that a lot of people would think that they would?
Yeah, so that was one of the interesting findings, and that was across the board. But I think they discuss it really well in the swap meat study. Again, that one that used Beyond Meat. If we look at the latest iteration of Beyond Meat products, they've actually cut the sodium content in like half from what they used to be. They're actually quite good now as far as sodium content. But when they did the trial, the salt content was much higher. But what they found was that the total salt content, the total salt intake in the daily diet ended up being about the same between the meat eating and the Beyond Meat eating group. And that's probably because if you have a pre-seasoned product like say a Beyond Meat or another plant-based meat that is flavored, with salt and other seasonings, you're not adding much salt to it. But if you take a plain beef patty, you're probably going to season it to make it taste better. And so their total salt intake ended up being roughly the same. And that might explain why we didn't see effects on blood pressure. Now, there could also be some protective effects of some of the components in the plant-based meats. For example, products that use soy protein, there's isoflavones, which might lower blood pressure a bit. The little bit of fiber in there might have a bit of a blood pressure lowering effect. So there could be other things there also countering the effects of sodium. But one thing I would really like to see moving forward is actually a study done in a population with high blood pressure. What happens if we take people who actually need to manage their blood pressure and we give them some of these plant-based meats? Does their blood pressure go up more? Maybe does it get better? Who knows?
Yeah,
That's something that we could study further.
that's a really interesting question. I would be really curious to see that, especially, probably among a population that may be struggling with their weight. I think that would be an interesting group to analyze. Could cholesterol also be a factor in terms of blood pressure? I'm sure that there are some people who are wondering about that right now.
That doesn't seem to have much of an effect, if any, on blood pressure. That is mostly going to be the salt content as like the single most important variable. But other things like fiber can play in, as I mentioned, and certainly weight loss can lower blood pressure. And as we noted in some of the studies, there was at least a little bit of weight loss as well.
All right, let's talk about the data that you guys were able to pull. You said you went back 5 decades, and you said that you actually found some information on plant-based meat alternatives dating back to the 1990s. I mean, God only knows what that tasted like. But what about, in the 1970s? I think maybe 1970 was the first year that you guys were actually able to pull data that was used for this review. What kind of data was that?
So actually, in 1990, it was corn products, which you might be familiar with.
Oh,
The
what the corn with the Q?
Yeah,
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 okay.
yeah, yeah, yeah. So because it was done in the UK and that's been used over there forever. The first iterations of them, I think, came out in 1985. But the reason we decided to scan back to the 70s is when we look at sort of modern plant-based meat alternatives, corn being one of them, of course. We saw that based on actually a New York Times article, they started to really gain traction through the 80s and then obviously grown since then. But they were largely being produced or initially being produced in the 70s for a lot of these different early iterations of plant-based meats. So I wanted to see, like, did we really have any trials, any data on them at that time? And we didn't really. So there wasn't really much to pull from that time period. But there were some studies on different types of nutrients, for example, like dietary cholesterol intake that we could look at from that time period, which were discussed in the paper. But yeah, we didn't end up seeing anything. We were just trying to scan for as far back as we could reasonably do.
Yeah, I was just thinking, I was like, was there even any sort of commercially available meat alternative at that point, other than fresh produce or, something that you would have to make yourself? I don't think that there may have been. I mean, corn might have been first to the market. I don't know. I don't know the
Corn
business
was
of
one of the
plant-based.
earliest. Yeah,
Yeah.
actually, the earliest, just a fun fact, the earliest commercially available plant-based meats were in the 30s.
What?
In the Adventist populations. They were the first to produce them, as far as I'm aware. And that was in the 30s. But as far as really gaining more traction in sort of the kind of general market, it was more so in the 80s, and with corn being one of the earliest ones.
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay, that is interesting. That is interesting. All right, that's your fun fact. That's a Jeopardy question right there.
Yeah.
Yeah, man. All right, so then that's the early end of the data spectrum. Let's flash forward because you pulled data all the way up until last year, 2023. I know that this review in particular was looking at the long-term health implications. So what value did data that is so fresh and recent give you guys?
So actually, what we were looking at were mostly cardiovascular risk factors. So these could be studies that were a matter of weeks to months long. I would love to see like decades-long follow-ups, and I think that's something we're going to see moving forward. But we were primarily looking at trials evaluating risk factors like the cholesterol numbers, the blood pressure numbers, et cetera, that we've already talked about, because we can make certain assumptions or predictions about how that would affect our health. And based on what we found and how we change those risk factors, if you were to swap out meat for plant-based meat alternatives on average, we would expect to see reductions in cardiovascular risk. Of course, some products might be better than others, which is something that I mentioned. Obviously, there's variability, but just on average, with the products that have been studied, we should see benefit. And I would like to see that confirmed or maybe refuted, who knows, with more long-term follow-ups.
And are you guys able now to say, well, eating, say, a Gardein or a corn, we'll stick with corn, a corn chicken patty will give you X percentage less risk of an adverse cardiovascular outcome compared to eating a piece of chicken itself?
So you could, there are certain risk calculators you can use based on like how much you reduce your LDL cholesterol or ApoB. I would have to do the calculations, but it could be, and I'm just estimating, I don't want anyone to cite these numbers exactly, but it could be somewhere in the 10 to even 20% range if we're talking about every single day. Like if somebody who eats that meat every single day and they were to swap them out for the plant-based alternative, based on the reductions in LDL cholesterol we see, it could be in that range.
Oh, that's pretty impressive. And that's just by switching out the meat. Again, don't take those
Yeah.
numbers as the
Yeah,
gospel.
yeah.
You got to fact check it. That doesn't take into account other lifestyle factors.
Mhm.
Um, but I mean, that's still a pretty big reduction. Is that kind of on par with a lot of, prescriptions that somebody might be given from the doctor as well?
No, no. Well, if we talk about like intensive lipid lowering therapies, it's much greater. And one of the things that we have to consider is I'm talking about over a lifetime. So, if we look at someone who has significant atherosclerosis, and we start lowering their lipids, their say cholesterol numbers, late in life, you're not going to see as much of an effect or as much of a benefit as you would if you were to start that much earlier on. So, what I really want to see is and I'd like to do this trial. Maybe we will. There are some meetings happening, but I'd like to see a trial where we actually swap out specifically processed meat for some of these plant-based alternatives that are low in saturated fat. Because when you look at processed meats, they're high in sodium, so you'd be on a relatively level playing field there. And processed meats are generally very fat rich, very saturated fat rich. And if you were to replace that with unsaturated fats, I think we could see substantial reductions in these markers if they're consuming those processed meats regularly. So you would want to look at populations who are having bacon, sausages, lunch meats every single day, really. And so those are the people who stand to benefit the most, not someone who's having these things once or twice a week.
Right. Well, I mean, that is the standard American diet, my friend. I can't speak for Canada, but here in America, man, we love our processed meat, my friend. Love it.
Yeah.
Speaking of fats, in terms of the risk factors you guys were looking at, what kind of variability did you notice between the type of oil that might have been used in these various products? Were you able to extrapolate the data and really break it down there, whether it be vegetable, olive, or coconut oil?
Yeah. There were, I would say most of the studies used coconut oil or something similar, relatively high in saturated fat. If we look at the swap meat trial again, and I keep citing that one just because it is probably the most well known, but it's similar to some of the other trials. They used products mostly with coconut oil, which are closer in saturated fat content to the animal-based meats. Yet they still saw benefits for these lipids. Now, I would predict that we'd see larger benefits if you were to replace that with olive oil or other unsaturated fat-rich oils. And one thing that is really cool, and I think underappreciated about these types of foods, let's say processed foods, as as something that could be underappreciated about them, is that you can reformulate them. You can't just reformulate a cow, but you can reformulate a Beyond Meat. And that's what they've done. And so if you look at the latest iterations, they use avocado oil. It's very low in saturated fat. They've actually upped the protein. They've lowered the sodium a bit. And so I suspect if you were to redo that trial with these avocado oil containing Beyond Meats that are low in saturated fat, we'd see even greater benefits than what we're seeing in those prior trials. Do we have the studies right now to make those comparisons? Not really, but that makes it even more impressive that we saw any benefits at all.
Have you done any taste test trials of your own based upon these various new concoctions that they're
Um,
creating?
I haven't because it's not in Canada yet. It's only in America right now, the latest one. But I have heard it'll be in Canada eventually, but just not yet, unfortunately.
Hey,
I
man.
do want
Well,
to try it though.
come on down, man. Come on down. Anytime you're in DC, buddy, I will take you to the nearest grocery store and we will build ourselves a little feast in a shopping cart. That's pretty cool. All right, so we talked about body weight, waist circumference. Um, I guess then let me ask you this. I mean, pound for pound, calorie for calorie, what was the average difference there? Was there a big fat and caloric difference between these two options, the plant-based meat alternatives and traditional meat?
So they were made to be, or at least in the trial, they were designed to be about the same. Now, what could have happened and what likely happened was that the plant-based meat, for whatever reason, was maybe a little more filling, and that could have to do with the fiber content, perhaps. Even though it's not a ton of fiber, it's a little bit, and that could have led to people eating less overall, just because they got more full, and therefore they lost a little bit of weight. And it wasn't a lot; it was like over a 8-week period, a couple pounds. But for just swapping out meat for Beyond Meat, that's pretty good. That's a you're not really changing too much. It's got to be one of the easiest things to do as far as at least shedding a couple pounds. But I wouldn't say it was an earth-shattering difference in body weight.
All right, that's good to note there. I like the transparency. You were also pretty transparent though about, and this was noted in the press release that was sent my way, saying, "quote There is a current lack of long-term research evaluating how these alternatives may affect the risk of developing a heart attack or stroke." So a lot of what we're talking about here today. Because there is not that official long-term data that you say like we need, you kind of couched it, and I think it's important to frame the conversation. So a lot of this is, I mean, is it too much to say that it's hypothetical, or how much of an educated guess are we making here?
No, so it's not hypothetical in the sense that we're looking at like causal risk factors. So risk factors that we know play a very important role and can ultimately cause atherosclerosis. Like we know LDL cholesterol is a causal risk factor. We know blood pressure, even though we didn't see a significant difference here, is a very important risk factor. But so based on that, based on the fact that there were no real downsides as far as we could see in the available data, and that there were reductions in LDL cholesterol that could be clinically meaningful, if maintained long term, that would be expected to lower risk. I would stop short of saying that is a guarantee or that is we are certain about that without having more long term data actually looking at those outcomes. But we can be fairly confident that it would at least be neutral, if not beneficial, for cardiovascular outcomes. There is actually some long-term research on like bone health, and they suggest that plant-based meat alternatives can actually lower risk of fractures, certain types of fractures. And there's 1 or 2 studies on different cancers. I believe there was a reduction in the risk of fatal pancreatic cancer, but no significant impact on another form of cancer. And I can't recall off the top of my head. I think it might have been colorectal. But anyway, there's potential benefit for other outcomes as well. But we just need a little bit more data on these topics.
All right, let me ask you this. Hopefully, you feel like this is a fair question to ask, just a little bit of a devil's advocate. How much of these reductions can be attributed to the plant-based meat alternatives themselves, and how much should be chalked up to the fact that they're just not eating meat any longer?
It's definitely both. In fact, I would say that that's the case with pretty much any food we look at. You have to look at what you're adding and what you're taking away. You're usually not just adding without taking something away. And so in this case, and we talk about this in the paper a little bit, I suspect that the reduction in saturated fat, so even though we didn't see huge reductions because of the types of products they use in these trials, there was a reduction in general. And that's because meats tend to have a high saturated fat content. These plant-based meats tend to contain less. A reduction in cholesterol. So animal foods contain cholesterol. The plant-based alternatives generally don't. Unless they have some animal products mixed in. The higher fiber content, again, plants contain fiber, animals don't. So there's sort of benefits and drawbacks on both sides that can lead to these reductions that we see. The positives with the plants and the potential negatives with the meats.
And let me ask you about something here too. Vital wheat gluten is another thing that kind of piqued my interest here. Again, you went out of your way to note this in the press release, saying that there was a near complete lack of research on vital wheat gluten. Why do you think that that was important to note?
So one thing that we also did, and maybe we should have even mentioned this at the beginning, is we looked at what are the common components of these plant-based meats. So for the oils, we kind of already talked about those, but for the protein sources, there's soy, there's pea-based protein, mycoprotein, which is sort of like a mushroom. It's not exactly, it's a fungi like a mushroom that it's sourced from. And then there's the vital wheat gluten, which is the wheat-based protein. Those are probably the four most common, but there are a number of different options. It's really endless as far as what can be used as a protein source. And there was some data that we could draw from like for each of those except the vital wheat gluten. There was like one study that wasn't really related to the topic of heart health, at least not in the way that we would have liked, and which I thought was surprising because that is one of the products that has been used for quite a long time. It's especially popular in UK and Europe, and I was just over there and you see it everywhere. All the grocery stores have seitan based products or vital wheat gluten based products. So I just a part of the purpose of this review was to provoke further research. And so I really wanted to go out of my way to highlight these are the gaps in our knowledge, things that we could get or could further study and that would be useful to understand, right? If we say study vital wheat gluten, we find, oh, it's not as good as like pea protein or soy protein. Okay, well then maybe we focus more on those other alternatives. But if we see that there are some unique benefits to vital wheat gluten, great, let's include more of that. So that's the reason that we mentioned that.
All right, rank these for me, if you will, in terms of most healthy to least healthy. So let's go ahead and we'll say Beyond Burger. Then we'll say regular hamburger, a slice of ham for a sandwich, and then bacon. So there's your
Okay.
four. Go ahead and give me Dr. Nagra's rankings.
Okay, so I'd probably put bacon at the top as a processed meat, as well as like the sliced ham sandwich meat would be maybe just under that or around that. And then I would put the hamburger, and then I would put the Beyond Meat, especially the latest iteration, as being the healthiest of those.
Gotcha. And if Dr. Nagra is going to his kitchen and he says, I want the most healthy thing in the history of ever, what would you reach for personally, based off of not just this research, but everything else you know? Because God knows if you follow you on Instagram, that's at dr.matthewnagra, heck of a follow. You dive into all kinds of literature on there.
So do you mean specifically regarding plant-based meats or beyond
Plant-based
that?
meats, we can go beyond that. I mean, if
Okay.
this is your kitchen, bro, I don't know what's in your fridge.
Oh man, I don't. I'd probably go for some kind of like beans or something. There's so many ways to answer that because of the different food groups. But if we're going for just a plant-based meat, I don't know that there's one that clearly stands above the rest. So I don't know if this is cheating, but I would just kind of give a checklist of what I would look for, if that's okay with you.
Go for it, man. Give me
Okay,
your
okay,
checklist.
okay. So first and foremost, I would look at saturated fat content. So on the back, the nutrition facts label, it'll tell you how much of these nutrients in a serving. If it's a burger, usually within one patty. If it's a sausage, it'll be in one sausage. And I would generally look for products that are low in saturated fat, say 3 grams or less being a pretty good guide. If we check that box, we move on to the next one. And I would probably look at the salt content or sodium content. And I would want the sodium sort of as low as possible. Plant-based meats are notorious for having high sodium contents, but we're seeing that be lowered with the newer iterations of certain products. So generally around 300 milligrams or so, or less if possible, is really solid. Once you get up into the 5, 6, 700 milligram range, I mean that's best limited for sure. Once in a while, whatever, but I wouldn't want to have that regularly. Beyond that, I would look at the protein content. Generally, the higher the better. So, at least 18, 19, 20 grams in a serving or more. And then I would look at the fiber content with, again, the higher being better. But a lot of these plant-based meats are pretty low in fiber overall because that's how they get the consistency. They remove some of the fiber, which isn't a big deal. If you're eating a ton of fiber through the rest of your diet, it's not that big of a concern. But that would be maybe fourth on that list of things I would look for.
You an ingredient scanner at all, or are you going right to the nutrition label first?
Nutrition label for sure.
Really? You don't get scared when you look at the ingredients and it's like a mile long?
No, because I think there's a huge misunderstanding around a lot of the ingredients that are used. And I think it can look scary. So, um, actually, let's talk about this idea of ultra processed foods for a
Let's
second, and what they.
please,
Yeah.
please,
Okay.
let's get into it.
Okay. So, ultra labeling something as an ultra processed food really tells you very little about its health value, how healthy it is. It's more so about the types of ingredients that are included. So, if something is group one or unprocessed or minimally processed food, it's generally untouched or might have a little bit of grinding process involved or milling or something. But that would be considered a unprocessed or minimally processed food. A group two food, and this is based on the NOVA classification, who classify these foods as processed or unprocessed. A group two food is a culinary ingredient. So this is usually extracted from those whole foods through various processes like pressing. So like oil would be one, salt would be one, sugar would be one. Then group three are processed foods. So not ultra processed, but just processed. And this is essentially where you just mix a lot of ingredients or multiple ingredients from those group one foods. So like processed or minimally processed foods and the group two foods. So those different ingredients like oils and stuff. So an example would be like canned beans would be considered a processed food because you have the brine and the salt in there perhaps, but otherwise it's just beans. And then you have group four ultra processed foods, which are generally comprised of industrial ingredients. But this is so vast. Like there's so many different things that would fall under the umbrella of ultra processed. You have obviously processed meats like sausages, as I mentioned. You have Coca-Cola and other sodas. But then you have whole wheat breads that are bought in the store. You have whole grain cereals. You have soy milk. When you buy that, that's ultra processed. You have flavored tofus like smoked tofu. Those are all considered ultra processed, but those latter three or four there that I mentioned are quite healthy, whereas the first two, not so much. And we now have more studies that separate the different kinds of ultra processed foods and see, okay, which ones are actually responsible for the poor health we see in people who eat a lot of ultra processed foods. And it's mostly the processed meats and the sugary beverages, while other things like whole wheat bread and whole grain cereals are actually healthy. That's why this sort of research is really important, because we want to see like where on that spectrum do plant-based meats lie? Are they on the side of where we see the processed meats and the Coca-Cola, or are they on the side where we see like whole grain breakfast cereals, or are they perhaps in the middle and more neutral? So when we look at an ingredients list, let's take a soy milk, for example, store-bought soy milk. You'll see maybe 15, 20 ingredients on there, and some of them will be really complex names. You'll have things like cyanocobalamin, ergocalciferol, calcium carbonate, and so on. But most of those are actually just added nutrients. Cyanocobalamin is B12, ergocalciferol is vitamin D2, and then I can't even recall the calcium citrate or carbonate was the last one I mentioned. That would be calcium. And so just the fact that there's these like complex names and a long list doesn't necessarily mean the food is unhealthy. In fact, in that case, those added nutrients make it a better product. So we can't just throw away something because of the fact it includes ingredients. And I generally don't pay too much attention to those. If you know that there are certain things that you can't consume or have issues with, people with gluten issues, for example, well, then obviously you need to read labels and make sure that they don't contain gluten-containing ingredients. But otherwise, I think the nutrition facts label is much more important.
Yeah, I wish that they would, kind of in parentheses. I know that some products do this, like with the cyanocobalamin, like put in
Yeah,
parentheses B12 next to it, which is
yeah,
great because the average person is going to have no daggone idea
yeah,
what
yeah,
that is. Like I only had two out of the three, to be honest with you. I had no idea what that D2 was. I was like,
yeah.
what the heck is that? So up in Canada on the nutrition labels, with the ingredients, are food manufacturers able to just list this vague thing called natural flavors?
Yeah, they can.
Okay, I mean, and I guess like this isn't on topic for the subject of the day,
Yeah.
but like that concerns me because it's so vague and you can like cloak so many things in natural flavors. Eh,
Yeah,
I don't know.
it is vague. It doesn't tell you exactly what it is, but in order to be approved for use in foods, they go through all sorts of like toxicology testing and everything, and the doses are tiny. Typically. So again, there isn't a good reason to really be concerned about that. Of course, if someone is, that's fine, and you can just choose a product without that. But I think that is like the last on the list of things to be worried about when you compare it to saturated fat and sodium and all of that.
I think your opinion is one that resonates with the majority of people out there. I know that a lot of the exam roomies are super health conscious, eating a salt, oil, and sugar-free diet. But that is not the majority of people in this world. The majority of people probably just breathed a sigh of relief over the last half hour or so listening to you talk, because you definitely bring a different opinion than a lot of the experts who have been on the show. And for that, like, I'm grateful, because it's so important that we get these different perspectives, and then somebody can make up their own mind for what they think is best for them. So, man, I'm really glad that you were here to bring some different flavor to the table today.
Well, thanks for having me on, and thanks for platforming these different voices. I think that's really important and good to have these conversations. Hopefully, give people another perspective.
Of course, man. And my final question to you, Dr. Nagra, is this. I mean, we talked about, some of the research that you might want to see, but, what other things would you like to see into the future? Where does this need to continue to go?
Well, I think for one, we're going to keep getting advancements in the sort of nutritional profile, the makeup of these foods, and I think we can just keep making them healthier and healthier, which is great. And the more that we learn about them, the more that we study them, the better idea we'll have on how to do that. I do want to see these healthier iterations becoming more widely available. So hopefully that is something that comes into play. I know we're seeing it prop up in all sorts of restaurants, and I mean, they're in every grocery store, a lot of times in the meat section, which is really cool. And I'm hoping to be involved with some of the studies, looking at some of the questions that we ask in the review. So obviously look forward to that. Hopefully we make something like that happen in the next year or so. And I will definitely keep you updated. But I think there's a lot of really good things happening here. And perhaps this provides a way for us to reach people who otherwise wouldn't change. Like if you think about the average or the general population, the average person, they aren't going to swap out a ground beef for lentils most of the time. But if they can swap out the ground beef for a veggie ground and it tastes similar, it looks similar, smells similar, then those are the types of people we can hopefully reach here, better for their health, better for the planet, better for the animals, of course. And so I think it's a win-win-win if we can showcase that, hey, these things taste good and they're good for you, or better for you at least.
Yeah. Baby steps sometimes. Baby steps. I don't think I went ground beef to lentils overnight either, man. Like, I definitely went vegan overnight, but it was a process getting me over to the end of the spectrum where I'm at today, man. And so I think that, again, a lot of people breathing a sigh of relief, my friend. A lot of people. So my hat is off to you, Dr. Nagra.
Thank you. Thank you.
The review is published in the Canadian Journal of Cardiology. There's a link to it in the show description and in the episode notes. And give my man a follow on Instagram. He is an instant follow, as a matter of fact. I do not give that endorsement out willy-nilly. This guy is hysterical and so well-researched and not afraid to speak his mind about the healthy stuff that matters. He's not going to be divisive. We're not talking politics. We're talking health here, and he talks about it so well. Dr.Matthew Dr. Matthew Nagra on Instagram. You are the man. We will talk to you again soon, my friend.
Thank you. Look forward to next time.